I actually was just talking with Alexis the other day about his essay, The Signifying Monkey, which I read in grad school and like found compelling, but also it was like I could tell at the time it was the sort of thing like I wouldn't. It's like I'm not going to be able to remember the whole way this works in my head. Like I'm going to have to come back.
Sure.
So that's when I think like I do want to try to come back to at some point. So maybe if I have questions, maybe I don't know. Or I don't know if you're having his number means you have any understanding of his work.
When I was figuring out who I was as a Black person, I was reading a lot of Cornell West and I was reading a lot of Henry Louis Gates Jr., but I was not reading like his literary essays. I was reading more his things having to do with culture and philosophy. And so I have not really engaged with the signifying monkey. I own it, but it's just like there's a huge, unbelievably large stack of books that I own that I haven't read. And
I
it's
can
like,
imagine. Yeah.
yeah, and like it's like my engagement with books is so capricious, and like it's usually the book that I just bought, and if I can convince myself to start reading it that day or the next day, I will read that book. But if I don't, then another book, I will have bought another book by then, like 2 days later. So like I'm reading Joya's Seneca, The Madness of Hercules, and his the pentameter is pretty nice in that actually. And but I've been reading the introduction because he does makes a case that is perhaps a little hyperbolic, although he seems to offer evidence of which one is maybe a little suspicious because you're like, is there evidence that you're not offering? But he seems to offer evidence that at least for the Renaissance dramatists, Seneca was like where it was at. And I guess that's maybe true. I like Seneca, I think, his plays, not his, Stoic philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
for what I think people don't like him for, which is like essentially an extreme sensibility, which I find appealing. It's one of the reasons like I like Samuel Beckett, etc. I like
Yeah.
extreme art. I
Yeah.
like, I feel like an obligation to. I feel like I obliged to know as much of everything to do with literature, particularly in sort of the English tradition broadly understood,
Yeah.
as I can, which takes in, the Greek and Roman poets and dramatists, etc. And so Seneca is just a place that I hadn't touched on yet, not the plays, but I'm sort of excited to be making my way through that stuff right now.
Yeah. I read more recently. I actually read his letters from a Stoic because Dana Joya recommended them.
Hmm.
He was giving a tableside chat at Westchester about how great the how great the Roman/Italians were, because in Roman law you could kill yourself to preserve your family, your inheritance for your family. And
Sure, I don't know how great
yeah,
that is, but
I was gonna say,
yeah.
I mean, it was like the individual honor being one question, but like the brutal society order being another.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, he recommended that, so I read it, and yeah, I mean, I'm glad I read it. I read a few of his plays in college, and maybe I think I read his. Does he have a Trojan Women as well?
Yeah, he does.
Yeah, okay, so I read that because I did a like a an adaptation of the Trojan Women for a thing a while ago. So it was mostly yeah. So no, yeah. So but that's probably the last thing of his I've read.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited about it. I'm ready to go, and I'm reading. I don't know. When I was a youngster, my personal rule was I would be always be reading 8 books at one time, and it was about 25 pages from each, and so it was about 200 pages a day. I'm not a especially fast reader. I just read a lot, but now that I'm like old, I find it difficult to maintain anything like that. So it's only like 3 or 4 books, and I don't know what it depresses me. Like I feel like I need to be reading more to get done what I want to get done, but I can't.
Yeah.
Mm. I got
I
so many
mean,
other things that I need
I
to
have that
do.
same feeling, but at like a way different scale. So I don't know if you're a fast reader or I'm a slow reader, but one of us is one of those things.
I think I'm. Uh, I think I read at a reasonable pace, but with the caveat, and this is relative to something that you said many, many months ago. Not many months ago. I read poetry super fast, and it has to do with how I want. I think honestly, it has to do with my sense of how I try to write poetry. I don't try to write it very quickly, but I do think that it's what I'm writing. It's working with, as we discussed yesterday, sort of parts of my mind that I'm not fully cognizant of at all times.
Right.
And I tend to want poetry to affect me in the same way. And that was also sort of related to a real severe inability to read poetry when I was younger. Like I couldn't, I think students are raised with some pretty bad ideas about poetry, and I think that they
Definitely.
affect how people engage with it. And I had a sort of unexamined and really unconscious sort of assumption that poetry was difficult, all of it, so that when I would see a thing in lines, I couldn't follow that thing from one line to the next. It felt like I was looking at a foreign, like a language that I didn't know,
Mm.
in almost in an alphabet that I didn't know. Like I could barely make it from word to word, and I think that was partly because I had been raised to think it was just too difficult to engage with. And so it took a lot of years for me to get through that, to be able to kind of understand poems and to not sort of automatically shut down. And during that time, while I was learning to understand them, I read a lot of poetry. And it, I think it affected me in ways that I couldn't be conscious of. And so I kind of got habits based on my inability to read poetry. I got a habit of reading poetry very quickly. And now when I read it, I think I can follow it, but I still have that sort of way of reading built in from my weird relationship with it.
Yeah, I mean, I, for me, I mean, I have a little bit of the trouble that I know. I think like because as a little kid, I read a lot of a lot of Sherlock Holmes in this giant old dusty copy that was my, grandmother's, and so it was done in those like terrible cramped double columns, that a lot of old books have where they're trying to fit more words in.
Oh
And
gosh, yes,
so
those are
yeah,
terrible.
I got used to reading those. So but I know like there are some people who have dyslexia or who have various other troubles who like if they see words in that kind of configuration, they can't decipher them. And I definitely have my ability to read certainly responds to the layout of the words to an extent that like often prose poems when they're in that big double justified block, it just makes my I just feel like my blood run cold. But like the little Cole
Sure.
Swinson prose poem that was in your West Branch thing is like it's so short that it was like, oh, it's like reading an email. Like it's wide, but it's short. So I don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't lose my way in it. But yeah, I mean, I find reading poems. I felt vindicated talking to Alan Shapiro about this the other day. Like when I read a poem the first time through, I get almost nothing from it. Like I get
Mm.
the sound, an overall sort of sense of the voice, but I get very little denotation from it. I'm able to
Mm.
put it together almost not at all. And it's really like I think part of the trouble for me is not that I read slowly exactly, it's that I have to read everything over and over again. And the
That
same
makes
tends
sense
to
to
be
me.
true for a lot of prose. Like anything that's not, I mean, I read a lot of old or weird or translated prose, but like anything that's not very contemporary, very magaziney, I have to really go through line and again to digest it.
Well, no, I mean, I understand that. And I think that my reading of poetry tends to be very suggestive. Like
Hmm.
it is essentially all suggestion.
Yeah.
Again, in the last, it feels like the last year or so, I can read poetry and like actually get what's being said to me. But that feels relatively recent. I still pick out, I pick out lines that I love, and I always have, but like getting the sense of the whole is a
Yeah.
relatively recent sort of development,
Do,
I
do you,
think.
because I know you've had a largely self-taught like development as a reader and writer. Do you have this experience? I feel like I've had where there have been like three or four different times throughout my life when I like learned to read. I remember thinking like, oh shit, what I haven't been doing this at all, both like in the past. Like
Hmm.
this is a whole thing that you do when you read.
Well, I can't, I can't take the credit. I can't say it's self-taught just because, I went to Iowa for my MFA, and I studied with Jory Graham at Harvard when I was getting my law degree. And so, when I was at Iowa and when I was with Jory, especially, that was real powerful instruction on how to engage with poems. And so, I was doing a lot before that, reading a lot of things on my own without anybody telling me, what I should or shouldn't read. But once I finally got to grad school, I was helped a lot. But I think that I constantly have that experience. Like
Yeah.
I'm saying, like I've just learned how to understand poems in the last year. But honestly, I've said that same sentence for probably the last 15 years. It kind of happens all the time where I think, oh, I finally get how to do this thing. It's useful to never feel competent. And
Yeah.
so I think that there's part of my feeling that I don't know how to do even the most sort of basic thing with regard to this art or whatever that I've sort of devoted my whole life to. Part of the reason I feel like I can barely do the most basic thing related to that is a kind of self-preservation. I think convincing oneself that one is actually really good at the thing one is doing is deadly. Yeah, I think I'm doing some helpful self-delusion.
Do you, as someone who gets a lot of pretty public and emphatic praise, do you have the same allergy or suspicion toward it that I tend to? So I'm much luckier in not being exposed to it, but I'm curious, like because you seem to be very cautious about like even characterizing the way you do your work at all.
Hmm.
Like you
Um,
seem not to want to be like you seem not to want to have the problem solved as to what it is you're up to.
Oh, sure, and I don't think I can solve it. I mean, am I no, it's nice to hear nice things. And I love it. And I'm not against it at all. It's not an allergy. It's rather that when one hears nice things, and it's one or two things, there's 20 things. I think it kind of functions the same way because it's one or two, when you get that one or two nice, you hit those first few nice things, they're very buoying. They help you stay afloat, but part of you engages with it and it feels really good. Part of you, as soon as it hears that the good thing, moves past it because you have to sort of keep going. And
Yeah.
so I can't fully take all of it in and just sort of swim around in it and say, oh, this is so delicious and I feel great about myself. Because I think that that is a formula for sort of short-term ecstasy and long-term unhappiness. So, I hear that stuff when people say nice things about my work and or my poems, and I'm very glad and I'm very grateful. But I can't, yeah, I can't sort of live with it. But it's not an allergy. I love it.
Do
Please
you?
don't stop saying things.
Yeah, keep sending your praise, Shane's way. Do you find like, 'cause I know you are like there are few people I've talked to on this podcast where I feel like I have to sort of like constantly frame like a vicarious disclaimer. Like I've talked like so much irresponsible trash so broadly, and like you actually know a lot of people and have like you are very frequently the one to say like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about when it comes to this person, or like you need to read this other thing that you're just not aware of.
Hmm.
You're generally exactly on point with that. But I wonder, like, you have changed some in your like in your poetry at the very beginning when you're publishing is it's
Hmm.
clear that there's a through line, but it's also clear that there's change happening. And as someone who also like knows a lot of accomplished poets at various stages in their careers, how do you think about that question of de- development or change? I mean, my terror is that like I don't want it to be true that poets get worse over time, but it
Hmm.
often feels that way, at least based on like what gets published or like sometimes it's like the like Denzel Washington winning for Training Day when he should have won like 8 times before that. It was like
Hmm.
this is a fine move. Like often that's the way prizes work. That's when somebody
Hmm.
gets really elevated, it's like, well, this is fine, but this isn't your best work by any means. So how do you
Sure.
think about that when it comes to your own work or when it comes to those you kind of observe like, close up or from a distance?
I mean, I've long been very terrified of getting worse as I've gotten older, and I'm not, in poetry terms, certainly I'm not old yet.
No, you're
But
young.
I,
You're a young
but
poet.
I,
Yeah, we've
I'm a young,
established.
I'm a
Yeah.
young poet, I guess. But I'm afraid of it. I think that there are some tricks that you can do, or maybe not tricks, but some sort of honest ways of thinking about the world and your place in it that are helpful. And I think one way is to try to be as humble as you can. I think that It's a weird thing to say when one is describing somebody like Yeats, for example, because Yeats was aware of his ability and etc. But I think that in relationship to the making of his poems, he was humble. I
Mm,
think that you kind of have to be. If you start getting convinced that you know what you're doing, I think that that's when you start to become crap. And I think that, like, when you look at how Yeats, for example, progressed, he was always kind of pushing himself. He was engaged with what the kids were doing, even if he
yeah,
wasn't going to write poems like they were writing. He was following what was happening. I think that you have to sort of stay in touch with some kind of youthfulness. You have to not consider yourself above whatever is going on. If you look at somebody like Jory Graham, who, I mean, I think that she's constantly progressing. She's constantly writing a new kind of poem. She's constantly pushing in a new direction. When, if you view her from the outside, you think, well, she's not obligated to. Certainly
right.
she's been very, very successful, but as an artist, I think that she feels that obligation. That why would she keep writing the same thing over and over again? Her third book, The End of Beauty, is one of the most original books of poetry in the 20th century. I always say that she's the most original poet since Hopkins, and I think folks who aren't engaging with her and looking at her career the way it developed, looking at her work the way it developed, are missing out. They're missing something really big. And The End of Beauty is the first sort of tremendous change in her work. And she's talked about how she has an entire other book of poems that sound like The End of Beauty that will never be published, that she wrote, and they're just in like archives. And I
Hmm.
and as a fan, I'm like, oh gosh, I really want to see that other book of
Yeah.
poems that sounds like The End of Beauty. But she doesn't publish it because she has to be pushing toward the next thing. And I
Yeah.
think that that's what keeps you from declining as an artist, if you're challenging yourself. And so it is a thing that happens. And I think even if you challenge yourself, sometimes it's inevitable. But I think that
Yeah.
challenging yourself and trying to find something new, I think that's a really good way to avoid it, to avoid that decline.
Yeah. And I mean that's the sort of the positive answer, but also I think you identified like a really significant negative answer, which is just because you've written something publishable doesn't mean you have to publish it. Because it does
Yeah,
seem like as
absolutely.
people get older and it gets easier to publish things, there's more and more work that's like, well, this is like, oh, I haven't heard your spin on Sunday mornings before, but like I guess I
Mhm.
have now. And
Yeah.
that feels like a lot of like second half of career books are full of those sort of poems. So I actually have a great deal of respect for that choice of hers to say like these poems are all perfectly good, and I'm not going to publish them because I want something more.
Yeah, no, I think and it's hard to do.
Yeah,
I have so many poems that I've written that I haven't published, so many poems that I've started that I didn't get to where I wanted them to be, many more poems that I haven't published than that I have. But it's tempting because people ask you for things, and you don't want to be like,
yeah,
oh well, I just don't have anything,
yeah, yeah,
because it's nice that people are asking, and you you know.
yeah,
But yeah, I think you have to try to hold on to things that don't quite meet whatever standard you set for yourself.
yeah. I've funny because I do a fair amount of soliciting poems for the magazine I help out with, and I had this sort of this double-edged feeling where like Joshua Beckman and Mary Jo Salter both give me this response, which I again like my initial thought is like, oh, I have so much respect for that, where they say, thank you so much. I would love to send you something. I can't right now because I don't have anything publishable.
Right.
And so part of me is like, God, that's so like I tip my hat to you. And then the other part of me is like, or you don't want to publish with me, like, or so I never know quite how to
I
read that.
think
But
it's
yeah, I think
honest.
yeah,
I
no, I
think
mean,
it's honest.
I think that you're probably right, but that yeah, that's the you're right. So it is especially like once people start asking you to send things, it is hard to yeah, it's hard to say no. And then well, I was going to say I actually have a related question. I thought about it a little bit on the last episode. I put out, and I thought about it again reading your little. So you did this little tiny selection for West Branch
Mm.
of, and I don't know how they organized this, but I can tell from the bios that it was within the last year. Is that right, or so?
Yeah, they asked me if I wanted to guest edit an issue of West Branch Wired, which is a thing they asked folks to do, and then I just got to pick the poets I wanted to put in it and ask those poets for things, and I can't remember when it was, yeah, within the last year that this all sort of started going, and it takes a little while to get things together, but yeah, it was pretty recent.
And it's, I mean, it seemed like it was, you have a I love because it's, I can just imagine, like, from the perspective of the West Branch people, like, they're excited to get you to do this, they're excited to get these four poets. You did get like a pretty formidable lineup. It's Jory Graham, Alexis Sears, Cole Swenson, and Jay Wright. Oh, incidentally, you know about the new book of prose from Jay Wright. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in my backpack.
Okay, good. Yeah. Good. I just wanted to make sure. And but I can see them, saying like, "Oh, well, here's a little online feature," and then and just the way you come into it is with this, like, extraordinary gravity and this, like, this enormous scope. Where you say, "When I was soliciting poems for this issue of West Branch Wired, I was thinking, as I often am, about history and which poets among my contemporaries were likely to have a prominent part in it." So it's like suddenly we zoom out to just see the graveyard.
Sure.
But yeah, but I mean,
I do
I
think
think,
about that
like,
a lot.
it's exactly, no. I mean, that's a, I am, when I hear that, my ears perk up, and that I feel like, okay, good. Like, that's what I'm interested in, and I think you're very, thoughtful and humble about, like, who knows how that's going to go, but, like, that was on your mind in writing, in soliciting from these four poets, and then including these four poems, which are, they're all poems I find, like, inviting, and then I don't leave any of them feeling like the matter is settled. Like, especially the Jory Graham one, which is just like, it's very skinny and long, and
Mhm.
it's the one I have sort of the least, her mode is the mode I have kind of the least practice in as a reader and writer, and so I mean, I think it makes sense hearing you talk about both composing and reading with a sort of pursuing first your sort of wandering intuition, and allowing a feeling and a set of associations to come over you without ever arriving at a solution. I mean, I imagine no matter how many times I'll reread it, I'll remain undecided about all of it. But I think, like, acknowledging that this is sort of, you can't know what posterity is going to think of any of this, and who knows where these poems will even stand in the collected works of each one of these poets. But, like, here's sort of four meaningful contributors to poetry today. Like, these are four people who are writing poems, and they're all writing poems right now from a kind of an interesting stretch of generations. And, like, these are like four poets worth considering alive today. Like,
Mm.
it did make me wonder, though, about a slightly broader question. So you edit poetry for Image.
Mhm.
An Image is a, I don't want to say lightly or loosely because that sounds dismissive. Like, it's a religious magazine, but not a it's not a claustrophobically religious magazine. Is that
Sure.
accurate? Yeah.
Yeah.
But the poetry is also the minority of the magazine.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. So that is, like, you edit that, and then I know Joshua edits the poetry for Root Quarterly, but that's, like, I think it's just two poems an issue. So with those, it does seem like you can keep this sort of, like, West Branch Wired, four poems selection, graveyard view approach to poetry. But I wonder how you think about publishing magazines more broadly. Like how should, because it seems like one answer would be, well, editors for magazines should only publish poems that that they think about the way you think about these four poems. But of course,
Mhm.
like, that only works if you're only publishing a very small number of poems. And if you're even a relative, 32 poems comes out only twice a year, and it's a little tiny pamphlet, but, like, that's still a shitload of poems
Yeah.
from, like, a historical perspective. And so I've had interesting conversations with Ryan about, like, how he thinks about what what the editor should have in mind as he's approaching these poems. think William Logan has said like, oh, there are only two poems I've read in my lifetime where I thought this is going to be a real keeper, and it was High Windows and One Art. And it's like, well, okay, all right, like if that's true, like
Mm,
good call, but like you can't approach
yeah.
magazine editing that way. So like how should this happen right
Well,
now?
let me approach this a couple ways. First is to say I love Bishop. I don't like One Art. I don't think that's a very good poem, but I
You
understand
don't
that
like
people
One
like
Art,
it.
okay?
No,
All
I
right,
think it's
okay.
not. I think it's too self-conscious. It's too kind of contrived. That sort of last write it like there's a real crisis going on is, you've got the villanelle, this repeated form, you know what's going to come around. And so when she gets to the last, write it as if she's like clenching her fist and like holding it down with the other arm and forcing it to write the words. You're like, come on, you knew this was coming. It's not, you're not, it's obviously kind of forced. And so I can't do it. I can't do it that poem. But I love Bishop. I love Bishop.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
just think that that's not by any means her best. So, but that question makes sense to me. I mean, Image actually publishes a lot of poems for. I mean, it's an interesting journal. It's my dream journal, and so the idea that they let me work for them is really it's really wonderful. They're very, very, very intellectually serious, very serious, but and their perspective is sort of broadly spiritual, but not in the way that not in when you say I'm a spiritual person and my skin kind of crawls. It's not that kind
yeah,
of
yeah.
thing. They're just not. They don't feel hemmed in by any particular tradition, but they're very, very serious. When I'm soliciting poems, I tend to frame it as poems that deal with sort of the big things or sort of the last things, the big questions about what it is to be human, and that tends to get poems that connect with what we're doing at Image. I do end up going for. I only want to publish poems that I really like.
Yeah.
Like I published that poem by Joshua Mahegan, the conclusion of which I'm pretty sure I disagree with entirely. But
Yes,
it
I would
does
imagine.
have
Yeah.
to do with the big questions. It does have to do with the things that Image is about. He just comes at it from an angle that's different from the angle that I would approach it from. But I'm always thinking, what can I get, what can I publish that I believe in, but also I guess what I would say is sometimes you're thinking, you know does this thing have some degree of historical importance, by which I mean, I got to publish when Ashbery, that John Ashbery book that came out like a year or so ago, that was unpublished, unfinished longer works, and
Yeah.
I got the opportunity to publish one of those in Image, and I thought, I love Ashbery. I don't know whether I would have published it. I mean, I like the piece,
Sure.
but it was rather, the first concern was like, here's my chance to publish unpublished Ashbery.
Yeah.
And so really, unless it was complete dreck, I was
Right.
going to publish it,
Yeah.
because it was of
It's a
historical
historically
importance.
important moment. Yeah.
Yeah. And so sometimes that comes into consideration. And I liked it. So it wasn't dreck. So it was good. Usually, yeah, I'm trying to publish. I'm not necessarily with each submission going, okay, is this person going to be read 100 years from now? I don't think that you can edit that way. I don't think that
Right.
that's
Yeah.
possible. If you're publishing anything like any journal, actually, I don't know that
Yeah.
there is anywhere you could do that. But I am always thinking, do I like this? And do I think, I don't even actually think, I don't even actually wonder whether other people will like it that much. I think, do I like this poem? And so I don't really, it doesn't matter to me who the poem is coming from.
Yeah.
It matters to me whether I like the poem. The way I think about it is, it's a lot like, I mean, the art in general. I think my view about it is more positive than yours, but I understand your view.
Mhm.
And I think it makes sense to me. But I tend to think of it like, even the poets that we, love, like I love Keats or whomever. I don't love every poem Keats wrote. And Keats, there's a pretty high percentage of poems that aren't very good. Um, I think with Keats, which is sort of surprising maybe, because his like big hits are big hits. They're
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
amazing. But he wrote a lot of poems that are just like, he started, for how long he lived, he wasn't writing poems that long. And so some
Yeah.
of them are just going to be not amazing. That's
Sort
fine.
of, sort of a Babe Ruth. It's like it's a
Yeah.
home run or it's nothing. Yeah.
I mean, there's a
Yeah.
lot of that with Keats. He did hit a lot of home runs, but if you read the complete Keats, which if you haven't done it, listener, you should, there's plenty in there that's sort of like, You know,
Yeah.
I don't know about that. And that's how it is with every poet. There are very few poets. The poet I can think of with the highest batting average is probably George Herbert, who just wrote a lot of
Mm.
perfect poems. For most poets, a lot of their poems they're not amazing. If you're really engaged with this thing, if you're publishing a journal or whatever, you try to publish the best stuff that you can. I never publish anything that I don't like. Everything that I publish, I think is good. I think it's worth reading. I don't expect every single poem to last forever, but I do think that every single poem has merits that I publish, that has merits according to which, if I were 100 years down the road and I stumbled across that issue of Image, I would open it up and I would look at it and say, oh, these are pretty good. I would
Okay.
still
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
them. Whereas you can, and that's sort of the standard I hold myself to. You can look at old issues of, like, if you have looked at issues of Poetry magazine, say from like 100 years ago, there's a lot of stuff in there by people you don't remember, and you read the poems, you're like, oh, I see why they're forgotten.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
lot of, and I think that
Yeah.
that's just how it is. But I always try to publish things that I think are good. And it can't all be home runs, because there's not that many home runs in the world.
Right. I was just thinking about, I learned recently that the prickly pear is the kudzu of Australia, apparently.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like somebody imported prickly pear to Australia for like some either cosmetic or like local design reason, and then it just immediately, it was like, it's something about it took to Australia and it just covered Australia, and now it's just like a
That's
horrible
a bummer.
pest. But I was just thinking about like the weird things that happen when you bring species from like, small continents to large continents, and like obviously famously like kudzu and wisteria, they've just like completely taken over the South. And so like part of me feels like, oh well, there should just be fewer of these poetry magazines. But then I also want, like, part of what makes species from large continents especially effective when they get imported to small continents, for the most part, is that there's just so much competition. When you just have this like enormous pool, often like, it's not necessarily that like, oh, if we just had fewer magazines we'd be publishing less direct. It's like part of getting some of the good stuff is having so many shots on goal, to muddle my metaphors.
Yeah.
But I do like, my feeling in almost every context, in almost every publishing context, whether it be individual or editorial, is like, what if we just published a little less? What if it's just a little
Sure.
less?
No, and I think that I understand that feeling. I understand that feeling. I think that there is a good argument to be made for it. But here I'm going to play not devil's advocate, because I actually kind of believe in what I'm going to say.
Yeah, please.
I'm going to play here's why that's totally wrong.
Okay.
And so the reason it's totally wrong is, if we're looking at it from the perspective of, say, sort of the ideal version of ourselves, ideal you, ideal me, we have a lot of time to read. There's a sort of overwhelming variety in the world. And the vast majority of it we're not going to ever even get to look at. Even the vast majority of literary magazines at a reasonably well stocked bookstore that sells literary magazines, we're not going to read all of those any month that we see them. And so from our perspective as individuals, yeah, it makes sense. Wouldn't it be great if they published more, if they only published the hits?
Yeah.
But in a planet filled with however many people who read English, and however many of those people might pick up a literary magazine,
Yeah.
you want there to be as many options as possible, because literary magazine X might not be within reach, but literary magazine Y that you or I aren't ever necessarily going to even open might be the literary magazine that's at the bookstore or at the library where this person lives. And so that might be the only one that they get. And so from our perspective, oh, this is just extraneous, we're not going to look at it, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
From their perspective, this is it, this is my thing. And that might be the magazine that they open and like discover that they love poetry. I like the idea of there being variety, because if there is a large pool, then there's the possibility that there's more possibility for folks to have access. So, and that's a
Mm.
kind of, frankly, I understand a kind of naive perspective, because there's also, economical considerations, etc.
Sure.
But I think as long as folk outlets are willing to exist and to make themselves available to whomever might grab a hold of them. I am happy with there being a lot of variety, just because who knows which one of those things is going to be the thing that the kid who doesn't have any direction in life is going to engage with, and suddenly it puts them on a path toward a thing when they didn't
Yeah.
have a thing before. So I don't mind that. It doesn't bother me. But I understand the feeling that it would be nice if things were reduced.
Taking the risk of what's the line in I don't know if it comes from Beowulf or if it's just something John Gardner picked up in his Grendel, but he refers to Grendel as a walker of the world's rim, which has
Mm-hmm.
always seemed sort of like creepy and evocative to me. But like to walk around the edge of the abyss of contemporary politics, I want to offer a parallel argument to yours that I
Mm-hmm.
think both of us might resist,
Mm-hmm.
which is like, all right, so what would be good is for everybody, like to the degree to which people can be informed about the world,
Mm-hmm.
know what's going on, that's good. And it would be better if people were more informed about what's going on in the world. And apart from direct observation or, social networks of gossip, online or offline, like people learn about what's going on from the news, and whether that's in print or video or audio, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So, uh, isn't it better for there to be more news and for there to be more? And like maybe some people are doing news in a way that others think is wrong or bad or stupid. But maybe
Mm-hmm.
if just to have more and more and more news everywhere, and some news is going to be within reach for this person, some news is going to appeal to that person. But if everybody is more exposed to more and more and more news, isn't that a net good?
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect both of us would at least raise an eyebrow at that argument. But I see it, or maybe I mean maybe not. I mean the other problem with any of these arguments is like both the conventional conservative and the conventional liberal response are flawed. One being like, well, wouldn't it be better if people were different fundamentally, and the other being like, there
Mm-hmm.
ought to be a law.
Yeah, sure.
So I think like this, it's not to say that there is an obvious solution to any of this, but I wonder about like there being some equivocation in like arguments about like, oh, wouldn't it be better if people can be exposed to poetry? I think like, well, what does being exposed to mean, and what does poetry mean? And like,
Sure.
yeah, I don't know, I'm not sure.
I mean, I guess mine boils down to this. I understand that there is a glut of poems in the world, but what single individual is actually glutted? Like nobody,
Oh, you don't feel
you know?
glutted?
No, I don't.
Really?
Really.
Do
I
you?
don't read everything.
No, I
Like I
know, but you
can't.
don't feel like the experience I have often is an urgency of one kind or another, to either that being like a specific request or instruction, or a sense of wanting to be up on things, or a sense that like there is something good and I need to find it.
Mm,
And then just being faced with a flood, just being faced with heaps of, it's like the thing, the way I feel is like the moment in every courtroom drama when the prosecution grants the defense's request by like dumping a truckload of documents on them to
mm,
say like, oh yeah, what the thing you want is in here somewhere.
mm,
Like that's how I feel. I mean, and that's where like I often like get a little bit prickly when people say like, oh well, you don't be so much a stick in the mud, you need to know what's going on. I think like, how the fuck am I supposed to know what's going on? Like there's so much I can't possibly part them. Like, I also just got done screening submissions for a poetry contest,
sure.
which is like exactly the kind of contest I also submit to. So I have respect for what people are going through, but like it does mean just being flooded with a lot of not very good poems. And to me, I just like I feel a rising despair when I'm faced with that. But you don't have that
Well,
experience.
I mean, I'm a reader for, let's just say, a book poetry contest. I read for it every year. It gets a lot of submissions.
Mm-hmm.
I do not have any readers at Image. We get a lot of poems. I just read them all myself. I was offered readers, but I don't want them. I want to pick.
Yeah.
So I am engaged with a tremendous amount of poetry constantly.
Okay.
It is what you're describing, I have a lot of sympathy for, but it's also you're choosing how to feel about it. I mean, poetry is not requiring you to feel that way. Poetry is just there. And it hurts my heart, truly. I don't want
Yeah,
you to
yeah,
feel like overwhelmed, but I mean, yeah, there's a lot of poems out there and I can't read them all, but you know what? There is, there is Jory Graham and I love Jory Graham, and there is Jeffrey Hill and I love Jeffrey Hill and I know
yeah,
that, and I can go read their poems. you know
yeah,
there are poets that I love and I know that I love them, and if I got to read a poem on day X, I'm not like fumbling around in this, like, drowning in a stack of thousands of books. There are books that I know and I can go grab those books, and then I go to the bookstore and I look at all these books that I don't recognize, and usually, if it's a book I don't recognize, I will pull it out, and I'll flip
yeah.
it open and I'll look at a poem and say, do I want to read the rest of this or do I not? And that's it. I go on with my life. There is a lot of it, and one has to choose a way to relate to it. But the fact that there is a lot of it, I can't see how that's harming anybody. Unless one feels, as I said earlier, I feel like a kind of obligation to know as much of everything that I can
Right.
know with regard to sort of the poetry tradition in English. But as much as I can know is the sort of important caveat. I can't know everything, obviously.
Yeah.
I read as much as I can, and it does not make me despair. It does not make me feel like I'm not keeping up. I'm definitely not keeping up, but I keep up with the corners that I can keep up with, and I do my best. That's all I can do. It doesn't make me unhappy.
We're way more well adjusted than I expected from having read at least the several long passages of your Hell poem that I've read, which is the most, I mean, that's just the scariest shit I've ever read. And
Oh, thank you.
so, but yeah, like I'm sort of amazed that you're able to be so Horatian about it. Kind of like, yeah, I'm less an antique Roman than a Dane when it comes to that kind of thing, I
Mm,
guess, personally.
sure. I mean, I totally understand that. I mean, there's a lot of poetry out there, and there's a lot of poetry that's wonderful that we have never heard of, you know? And I am constantly trying to figure out the right sort of internet search that will bring up a poet I've never heard of that I know I will like. Like poets influenced by Jeffrey Hill. I did that search just yesterday. And I tried to figure out ways of phrasing it so that I would get it was contemporary. It was actually contemporary British poets influenced by Jeffrey Hill. I was trying to like narrow it
Yeah,
down
yeah.
to a very particular field. I wanted to see if there's somebody out there that I hadn't heard of. And I'm constantly doing that, but I can't. If I spend my time contemplating all the art I'm missing out on, I will miss the art that I already have access to. I guess the other thing about it is I have not. I started writing when I was 15, and
Mhm.
before I started writing, I was just going to be a burnout. I was on my way. I had started failing school in the sixth grade, and I had not ever picked it back up. I thought I moved from Texas to California at this time, and I had spent so much time before the move cultivating the very few friends I managed to have when I was in Texas, and having some sort of social life. And this is related, although we don't, although this feels like me like dropping some sort of gigantic, I don't know what, right in the middle of the podcast and then saying, well, we're not going to talk about it. This is because I suppose we could. This is related, I think, to me being kidnapped, because I was
Yeah.
kidnapped when I was 3 years old and I was raised by my kidnappers. Having a social life and some sort of stable social life was indescribably important to me. And when
Yeah.
I had to leave Texas and leave behind the few friends that I had and go to California, I felt like my life was over. And it wasn't like the way that a 10-year-old might think or an 11-year-old might think, oh, my life is over. And then, like, 3 or 4 months, they start to, or less, they start to feel better and they make new friends or whatever. I made new friends, but I never stopped feeling like my life was over. And it was a wound that I couldn't heal from,
Yeah.
leaving my friends behind. And so by the time, I was 15, which is only 4 years, but if you think about it, 4 years for like an 11-year-old is an eternity. It's
Oh, yeah.
such a long time. And so by the time I was 15, I had been failing school for years. I didn't care about anything. I
Yeah.
skateboarded, but that was it. And that's the only thing that I had any interest in, that and music. And when I stumbled across poetry, I was a failure. I was poor. We lived in a manufactured home. We lived on food stamps and SSI and nothing. That's just sort of what my life was, and it would stay that way for years. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have any intellectual models. My family hadn't gone to college. Nobody I knew anything about poetry, but I kind of stumbled across Lady Lazarus by Sylvia Plath. I started writing my own poems that were very, very, very bad, but
Yeah.
people were encouraging to me. I think because teachers in particular, I think because they saw that I was gonna burn out. I had nothing, and they thought, well, he cares about this thing. We can encourage it, and they were very encouraging, even though my poems were terrible.
Yeah.
And so, I'm this poor, like, black kid who was a high school dropout. I had, a child when I was a teenager. I didn't have anything. I didn't have any expectations for anything. Nobody expected anything from me. I didn't live in an environment that would encourage me
Yeah.
to have anything. But I found this thing, poetry, out of nowhere. And my entire life has been built on it. Everything that I do is based on it. And so I owe my whole life to this thing. From that perspective, there can't be too much of it.
Right.
It
Right.
is it is everything in a lot of ways. And so, like, I mean, I believe in God very much, and that's a different kind of everything, a bigger everything. But
Sure.
in a sort of functional, like, my day-to-day life, I wouldn't be where I am very literally without having
Yeah. Yeah.
discovered poetry. And I don't know what I would have done. Every day feels very miraculous with regard to poetry. Every day feels like I don't know how I got here. I can't believe that I am here. I can't believe that I get to do this thing. I can get grumpy about it sometimes, but it doesn't really trouble me that there's a lot of it and that there's a lot of it that I'm going to miss. I just feel grateful that I have anything to do with it at all.
Yeah, that's humbling and makes a lot of sense, even even if I still feel like Abraham smashing on icons
That's
sometimes.
fine.
Which also, like, there's something like very invigorating about that idea. The same as like the idea of Jesus chasing the moneylenders out of the temple. But I
Sure.
think like the contemporary equivalent to that is like the Taliban blowing up the fucking Buddhas. So there's something both. Yeah, like it's a very a two-sided coin for people who are interested in the colossal bomb you just dropped. You have a
Mm.
memoir coming out.
I do have a
Is it?
memoir
Yeah.
coming out. And before I say anything about it, let me register my protest without describing it
Okay.
more fully. That Jesus chasing the moneylenders out of the temple is not the same as the Taliban blowing up Buddhas, but we don't need to argue
Oh,
about
no,
it.
no, no. I was
I'm just
comparing that more to Abraham smashing the
sure, sure, sure. Oh,
icons.
the
Yeah,
Abraham
yeah, yeah,
smashing.
yeah,
Sure, sure, sure.
yeah,
I get that. Okay, sure,
yeah.
fine.
No, yeah, yeah. No,
But
no. You're right. Yeah,
but
you're right. Those are
like
yeah. There's. I think the
um,
thrill I feel at the idea of Abraham is the same thrill I feel sometimes at the idea of Jesus and the moneylenders. But you're right.
sure.
That's not parallel to the Taliban.
But yeah, I do have a memoir coming out. It's coming out in August. August 1st, I believe. It terrifies me a whole lot, but I'm also excited that it is coming out.
And I've seen the cover online, but remind me of the title.
Pulling the Chariot of the Sun is what
Pulling
it
the
is
Chariot of
called.
the Sun.
Mhm.
Maybe wait a minute. Maybe that's not the one maybe I've seen the cover of like your maybe your next poetry collection I've seen the cover of.
I have another poetry collection coming out called The Many Hundreds of the Scent. Pulling the Chariot of the Sun comes out in August, and it is being published by Scribner. The Many Hundreds of the Scent. I think it was being published in November, but honestly, I might have seen that there had been a date change and that it was coming out in October, but I think it's November, and it's being published by FSG.
So I'm spinning through my various poorly organized and mostly vulgar knowledge of myth. And I think I
Mm-hmm.
initially heard you say that title. I initially read it as Driving the Chariot of the Sun, which would be a Phaeton reference, but this is Pulling the
Mm-hmm.
Chariot of the Sun. So
Mm-hmm.
what is those are the horses? What is
Yeah,
yeah,
those are the
okay.
horses.
All right. Okay, so yeah,
Yeah,
very very different mythological trajectory than Phaeton.
sure. And I guess I was thinking about There are a couple of things I was thinking about. I was thinking about how the sun has figured into white supremacist imagery, particularly like the
Mm,
black sun. And I was thinking about sort of what it is to be a kidnapped person because my grandparents who kidnapped me and raised me were white racists. And so I was, thinking about there's a way in which I don't know if I can phrase this the right way. At least I can't speak for the experiences of any other kidnapped person, particularly those who were raised by their kidnappers and were in some ways maybe dimly aware of it. I never really felt like part of the family of which I was ostensibly a part. I felt more like a pet, kind of. And I
mm,
suppose there's a way in which I was thinking about that position being in some very distorted way parallel to the position of the horses that pull the chariot of the sun, that my grandparents from their perspective, particularly as being racists, they would
yeah,
think of themselves as kind of like the sun, kind of
right.
like the source of light. And I am the black child that they stole and then are raising,
Mm.
and I can't be the source of light, but I can sort of be near the chariot, so I'm one of the horses, or the horse, was I guess what I was thinking.
So I'm curious because I did not realize until I researched that whole Toby Martinez de los Rivas controversy, and he's got a new book out now. I know Cameron's very excited about.
It's
Um,
fantastic.
and yeah, and I was gonna say, and I know you have been. I mean, yeah. So he had the poem called Black Sun that was
Mm-hmm.
in poetry that caused this big mess, and people accused him of being a fascist. I didn't realize until looking into that that there was even a symbol called the Black Sun that was, I think, like a somewhat obscure symbol that was in
Mm-hmm.
Himmler's castle. But that was like that was the first I'd even heard of that being having that same name. And I know you have been a champion of his work, but
Mm-hmm.
so this like the Black Sun is a symbol you had that had specific like that you were already familiar with, or that this is
I
just like to
wasn't
me.
familiar with its association with Nazism. I was familiar with the Black Sun in the way that I am certain Toby meant it, which was
Okay.
at the crucifixion, the eclipse
Oh,
that
oh,
happens at the
oh, oh.
crucifixion,
Okay. But you
and
mentioned, sorry, you mentioned it just now in reference to your grandparents and their
mm-hmm.
racism. So maybe I made a faulty connection.
No, no, no. I understand why. Yeah, I was unaware of that symbol in that context. But I was thinking when I was talking about the book just now, I was thinking about how that has been a symbol in white supremacist circles. But no, my
Ah,
my grandparents didn't like have it in the house,
okay.
at least not that I remember. But I'm drawing on all that information to sort of make the title work. But yeah, I was unaware of that as a thing until the controversy with Toby's poem.